it came out of necessity. So I was struggling communicating with the guys that have gone through my organization, because when they came back and they were struggling, they were having a hard day, they weren't reaching out, and I couldn't figure out why. And so I talked to some other nonprofits that are working with veterans, and they were all having the same problem. How do they stay connected with these guys? And so when a guy comes into your organization, to the time he receives actual benefit and starts turning the corner, can take weeks or even months or years, depending on how much time they put into it. So everybody was having a problem staying connected with guys. And when I talked to the guys that were in my organization, I'd ask them like, hey, why aren't you guys reaching out? It was, well, I don't want to be a burden, or, I just didn't think about it at the time. And so I went back to the books and I started studying like what happens when somebody's going through a mental health crisis, like what is physically happening in their brain. And I watched a lot of videos of suicide survivors talking about, they all regretted it. The instant that they committed suicide, they regretted it. And these are all people who have survived, like jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge or, shot themselves, things like that. Right. Yeah. And so at that moment, they instantly regretted it. And I thought, okay, so what is happening here? What's going on with the brain? And so I found a research study. It said that when somebody's going through a mental health crisis, parts of their brain shut down. So their frontal cortex stops operating normally. So in their frontal cortex, they have rational thought processes. They have good decision-making skills, long-term planning. But the most important thing they have is the ability to overcome impulses.
Okay.
And so when somebody's going through a mental health crisis, all of those faculties are completely reduced. And we know by talking to suicide survivors that suicide is an impulse, that they had an impulse and they acted on it. And that's the reason they acted on it, is because they didn't have the mental capacity to process through it. So it's not that these guys wanted to commit suicide. They just couldn't overcome the impulse to do it. And so I thought to myself, okay, so how, now I understand the problem in its entirety. How do we overcome that? And in my time working with veterans, I always gave an ambush analogy. I said, during an ambush, you feel like you've been, the enemy wants to attack you, overwhelm you with fire, separate you from your support network so they can overwhelm you and kill you.
Sure.
Well, isn't that what a panic attack feels like? That you're being overwhelmed with these thoughts, feelings, and emotions, which makes you isolate away from your friends and family. And then the depression kicks in and it overwhelms you. And then you want to commit suicide. I go, it's just like an ambush. So what are two things that we do? Well, number one, the first thing we do is we start returning fire. And so what are some of the positive things we can start talking to ourselves about? Remind us that, hey, we're in the US, we're safe, we're okay. I said, what's the second thing you're going to do? Well, we're going to call for support. Okay. You call for support on the battlefield. So how do you do that here? How do you phone a friend, call a buddy when you're struggling with mental health? And guys are like, well, I'm embarrassed. I don't want to be a bother to somebody. I said, well, would you feel embarrassed if you were taking fire and radioed in to get some air support? You wouldn't feel embarrassed about that. Like, no, not at all. I said, okay, so this is the same thing. So I broke it down to them like that. So with the app, it solves this problem in two ways. Number one, when people are struggling with their mental health and they're not able to process, who do I call? What do I say? What do I do? They don't have to worry about that. All they have to do is press one button on their phone, and it sends an alert out on the app.